Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our studies in Hebrews. We're in Hebrews chapter 12, and we're going to look at those first three verses in Hebrews chapter 12. Memorable verses, and I'm sure familiar to a lot of you. Session 18 in our series studying the book of Hebrews, and we're going to look at this section, verse 1, 2, and 3. Hope you've got it in your Bibles. Let's have a look at it. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Well, we're in Hebrews chapter 12, 1 to 3, and very much an important transitional paragraph as we move into these application sections of the great book of Hebrews. And it's very important not to disconnect Hebrews 12 from Hebrews 11, obviously, but also because it's very clear that we're moving from the indicative to the imperative, as they say. So we're moving from this illustration to application of the great truths that we've been taught from chapter 1 onwards. And remember, we've been looking the last couple of sessions at Hebrews chapter 11, the great hall of fame of faith. And the point of Hebrews unpacking all of those examples of the Old Testament heroes of the faith, like particularly Abraham and Moses and many others, is summed up there in the final two verses of chapter 11. So if we look at the context of chapter 12, it's there in verse 39 and 40 of chapter 11. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. That's the important summary and transitional verse to what we're going to unpack now in chapter 12. But it also understands us what sort of faith Hebrews is talking about. All of these heroes of the faith are commended for their faith by God: Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses. And with all of those examples, the same conclusion is drawn. None of them received what had been promised. Now that's very interesting and actually very important to understand, especially in this day and age where we have so many people talking about faith as being something that if you have enough of it, you'll achieve what you want in this world: success or athletic ability or financial success, political power, health, and so on. That's not the faith that's being commended here in Hebrews, and particularly in chapter 11. None of these great heroes of the faith actually received the promised reward of their faith. That's even more striking when you look at what some people did achieve by faith in Hebrews chapter 11. So in that little summary section of chapter 11, if you look back at that from verse 32, where Hebrews says, "What can I tell you about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets?" And then describes their faith victories, verse 33, "Who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, gained what was promised, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, escaped the edge of the sword," and so on. Weakness turned into strength, powerful in battle. Even verse 35, women receiving back their dead, their children coming back to life again. These faith victories, says Hebrews in conclusion of chapter 11, aren't what was promised. None of these believers, none of these heroes of the faith receive what is promised. Not even having your son raised to life from the dead again. And it's interesting that in some circles, in Christian circles and religious circles. These are the kind of victories that are assured for you if you have enough faith. These kind of kingdom conquering victories, these kind of success victories, even resurrection from the dead. I'm not sure why people want to boast about someone in their church being raised back to life again. For me, that's quite a sad thing, isn't it? Because you've got to die twice now. I mean, isn't dying once bad enough? So it's a question of the wrong focus there on what the reward of faith is. Hebrews tells us at the end of this that none of these heroes of the faith received what was promised. And so even those who had faith victories and those who had faith suffering, which comes after verse 35, those who were persecuted and died and were burned at the stake and sawn in two and so on, they are also commended for their faith. And yet, from an earthly point of view, it looks like they failed. Both groups are commended for their faith because what had been promised still lay ahead of them. Verse 40 of chapter 11. Since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. It's so interesting. I often think people would be tempted to say God had planned something better for them. But actually, it's something better for us because the great heroes of the faith are going to stand alongside us around the throne of Jesus. That is the something better plan. And you see, there's that word better again. If you look in verse 40, the better, Jesus is better theme that's been running all through Hebrews. God's plan has been better than all of these temporary faith victories here on earth because it is the eternal perfection that is coming as has been planned in Jesus. And that is what Hebrews has been unpacking from the start, that the promised plan, the better plan, is in Jesus, not in all these other distractions that you could be tempted to turn back to. Whatever you're tempted to turn back to, Hebrews, says the writer, whatever Old Testament heroes of the faith you're tempted to turn back and follow, remember, their faith was in Jesus, and their faith never resulted in them receiving the promise in their lifetime. Why? Because God had planned that it would be alongside us that final faith promise is received. And really, that's how Hebrews chapter 12 picks up. This is the promise of faith which these heroes of the faith had and had not received because God was waiting for us to be alongside them when we stand around the throne of Jesus. Therefore, these Old Testament heroes have a role to play, which we're going to unpack now as we begin chapter 12. And their role is to pass the baton on to us. That's the first thing I want you to see here, is this picture of passing the baton. So verse 1 begins chapter 12. Therefore, and by the way, that therefore is a very strong therefore in the Greek. The word literally means consequently. It's ensuring above all else that you do not miss this grammatical connection here between what's happened in chapter 11 and what's going to be unpacked in the instructions of chapter 12. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let's throw off everything that hinders and so on and run the race. You can't miss that Hebrews chapter 12 begins with this athletic imagery. It's very recognizable imagery in the first century because of the Olympic Games, which was prominent in that ancient Greek culture. And the writer of Hebrews is using that kind of Olympics imagery, talking about running a race and equating that to the life of faith. And so he says here, as part of that imagery, we are surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses as we're called to run this race of faith. And that great cloud of witnesses, of course, is referring back to all of these examples, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, and so on, in Hebrews chapter 11, these heroes of the faith. I've often heard in sermons the preacher say that this great cloud of witnesses is like the people on the stands in the stadium, and we're called to run the race, and they're cheering us on. And some of them even say it's like your beloved ones that have passed on and are sitting in the stands watching you run your race now and cheering you on. It's not saying that. this passage is not talking about your beloved loved ones who have passed on and are now watching you from the stands of heaven. It's not saying that here. And it's not saying that these heroes of the faith are in the stands cheering you on now either. It's not saying that at all. These heroes of the faith have a different role to play in this cloud of witnesses picture here. And it struck me that it's the experience I had when I was working at Newlands Stadium. When I was much younger, I worked as a medic at Newlands Stadium and worked in the medical section underneath the stands where the changing rooms are for the players. And when the players come out of their different changing rooms, they come down the passage, down a corridor, and then through a tunnel onto the field. And on the walls all along the passage and down the corridor are photographs of other great Western Province players who played in that stadium and had great careers. And so even now you'll see Siya Kolisi leading the team out to go onto the field. And they go past these photographs of, I know, Morne du Plessis and Chester Williams and James Small and so on, as they go out onto the field. And these are photographs of people who've played the game, who've had great careers, and who've had great victories in the stadium. And they are like the cloud of witnesses that surround the current believers who are going out to run their race. That's where the cloud of witnesses is found. They're not people sitting in the stands eating popcorn and drinking Coke, watching you play. They are people who've been out there and run the race and seen it through to the end. And the photographs are the example for you to follow as you go out and run the race to the end. That's the place of these athletes. And that's why the picture is of them handing the baton over to you. They've run their race of faith to the end and lived by faith right till death. And now they're handing the banner over to you, the baton, for you to run your race. So that picture of, firstly, handing over the baton is the imagery here in this athletic stadium. And then the second picture, of course, is the actual running of the race, which comes up here as you continue in verse 1. And when you read on there, verse 1 and into verse 2, there are three imperatives there, which are very clear in the Greek language structure. Most translations will begin with that let off. It's a passive imperative. Let us. It's a passive imperative. Let us do this. Let us do this. So it's an instruction in which you must then action. And there's three of them there in this second point of running the race. The writer of Hebrews says, first of all, if you're going to run this race, you need to shed weight. You need to shed weight. So that's the first thing you see there. Let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. That's shedding weight to make your race more effective. And we shed weight by getting fit and losing weight so that we can run more effectively, and also by getting rid of stuff that, clothing and so on. And actually, that's very much the picture here, because in the ancient Olympics, the athletes would arrive at the stadium wearing very colorful robes that they could be identified, very flowing, colorful robes that you'd know, oh, there's one of the athletes from Sparta or Greece or Rome or whatever. And when it came to run the race, they would shed these big colorful robes and they would run virtually naked, actually, in those days, if not completely without clothing, to get rid of anything that could encumber them in the race. And so the imagery is very vivid to those first century Christians. They would know what this imagery was all about. And it's a kind of a double picture here of stuff that can hinder you and sin that entangles you. There's a similarity but a slight difference. So things that can hinder us are not necessarily bad as such. There can be a lot of things that seem good and are good things to do, but can become a hindrance. I knew a chap I used to work with him many, many years ago, and he bypassed marriage and basically, any sort of progress in his career or anything, because his mother was alone, her husband had left her, and he was the only son, and she kind of convinced him to be there for him for the rest of her life. So he turned down opportunities for marriage, work, career, anything like that, and he just stayed looking after her, caring for her until she died one day in the house. And he was in his 60s already, and he couldn't drive. He didn't know, he couldn't do anything, and he had to start learning those kind of things from scratch. So on the surface, it may have looked like a good thing that he gave his time to looking after his mother, but actually it was detrimental to his progress in life. And we can get caught up with the same thing. We can get caught up with doing a lot of good things, looking after our family and our career and our children and ensuring their success and so on. And you can become so caught up in those good things that you forget the God things and the gospel things. And they become sidelined and well-intentioned but never actioned. Those can become the hindrances. And sometimes we can get so caught up with keeping up with the Joneses that we forget to keep up with Jesus and basically waste our life doing things that are good and important but not gospel, not gospel good. So that kind of unentanglement is important. The other entanglement is sin, the sin that so easily entangles or trips you up. Continuing with sin as a Christian, not going to send you to hell if you're truly born again, but it can certainly hinder your walk with the Lord and your effectiveness in the race of faith. And habitual sins that get a hold of you, that you won't fight and get rid of, will eventually trip you up. You know, sometimes when you watch a marathon, you see sometimes those charity runners come and they're dressed up as, I don't know, Barney the purple dinosaur or something. And then they run in the dinosaur suit. There's a guy who famously, I think, ran lots of marathons in a diving suit to raise money. That kind of person is not going to come first. As a matter of fact, they're not going to come anywhere near the top runners because they're encumbered with these entanglements, and makes it very difficult to run the race. And so what you have here is a picture of a person that's tangled up in their sin and in things that are hindering them from running the race. They're running with their flowing robes on instead of taking them off, and they're tripping on them. That's what sin will do to you in the Christian life. It's going to trip you up. So shedding weight is the first aspect of running the race. And then secondly, staying the course is the second one. If you read on in verse 1, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. That's a key sentence in this race metaphor. Run with perseverance. And that tells you that we're not talking about the 100-meter sprint here. You're not called to get your Christian life sorted by Friday and have everything done and be successful in the race of faith by the end of the week. No, this is a picture of an ultramarathon, the ultimate ultramarathon. This is the spiritual Comrades marathon. You run this race with perseverance. It's very interesting that the Greek word for race in this passage, running a race, is the English word for agony. It's where we get the word agony from, agona in the Greek. It's quite appropriate. Some of you may well think, if you're used to running marathon races, there is enduring the agony of that long distance race. And the Christian life can be agonizing as you continue to persevere day after day in the faith through great trials. And the Hebrews were too easily giving up. That's why this letter was written to them, because the daily grind of running the race of faith and not seeing reward can be discouraging. And it can feel like the race is too long. It can feel like the race is aimless. It can feel like this race is not going anywhere. And that is because you're losing sight of the goal. And that's why thirdly here is this picture of running the race. The third picture of running the race in verse 2 is seeing the finish. So fixing our eyes, verse 2 says, or let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. One of the keys to finishing the race is seeing where you're going and seeing the end in sight, seeing where you're finishing. And that's what's being said here. If you keep your eye on the finish, you're going to continue to run the race. If you can see the finish, you're not going to grow discouraged and give up. And the finish here is not some sort of temporary victory, like as we saw in Hebrews 11. It is Jesus in eternity and being with him. That's the finish line. Not financial success, not health, not any other things like that. It is Jesus. And Jesus, interestingly here, is called the pioneer and perfecter of faith. Very interesting words. Can also be translated as architect and completer, beginning and the end, author and finisher. And you get this picture here that Jesus is the one who begins and finishes our faith. It is Jesus that we fix our eye on, and it's Jesus who is the one who enables us to fix our eye on him. He is the author and finisher of faith. He is the start of our faith, and he's the finisher of it. It's him all the way. It reminds me of Philippians 1 verse 6, being confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it until the day of Christ Jesus. What the Lord begins in you, he will finish in you, and he will enable you to complete the race. Therefore, keep your eye on him, the one who is able to make it happen. And so Hebrews calls you to keep your eye on Jesus, and then Hebrews casts his own eye on Jesus, as he calls you, thirdly, to consider Christ's victory, to consider Christ and his victory. And so verse 2 goes on to say, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. There's the summary sentence of really the entire completed saving work of Jesus. And by the way, also what you have here is the motive for Jesus going to the cross. And that's a new and fresh point here. Jesus goes to the cross, and that's the victory that Hebrews wants you to keep your eye on. But also what Hebrews 12 wants you to know is why Jesus endured the cross. For the joy set before him, it says here. Now, was the cross the joy that was set before Jesus, that Jesus saw the cross and went, yay, what a joy? No, it's not. The very verse tells you it was a shameful thing. It's a painful thing. The cross is something that's terrible. It's an instrument of execution and torture, of killing someone in the most vile way and cruel and painful way. The cross itself is not the joy part. Even in those days, the cross wasn't considered something you would talk about in good company. You wouldn't mention it. It was such a shameful thing. It was reserved for the worst of criminals. As a matter of fact, if you were a Roman citizen, you were exempt from being executed on the cross because it was such a cruel thing to do. Only non-Roman citizens were crucified. So there's no joy in the actual cross itself as this instrument of death and torture. That wasn't the joy that's set before Jesus. It's not the joy set before him. The joy is what the cross accomplishes. And that's what caused Jesus to endure the cross. The joy was what the cross would accomplish. And the joy was great enough for Jesus to say that the cross is worth it. And because of what the cross would accomplish, Jesus endured it because of the joy that would come from it. And what is the joy that comes from the cross's accomplishment? It's you and me in Jesus. Jesus' vision of us being rescued from the consequences of our sin by him taking them to the cross on our behalf is what caused him to endure the pain. That's his joy, of us in glory with him, in Christ, delighting in him, in God. That's the joy that Jesus looked to as he endured the cross. That's the joy that Jesus looked at. And that's the joy the victory of the cross secures, bringing multitudes of sinners to salvation. Sinners like you and I, rescued from hell and brought to heaven when we turn and trust in Christ by faith. And so when you run the race of faith and you fix your eyes on Jesus, what is it that you are looking at? Well, you are looking at Christ's victory over sin at the cross, and the joy of Christ bringing sinners like you and I into his eternal family. That's what we're looking at. And that's what Hebrews is calling us to look at. This is your victory that Jesus has secured for you. And this is your motivation to keep running as well. In a marathon, there are water points along the way every few kilometers. And it's wise to take on water regularly as you're running a marathon. The more of those water points that you pass by on your way to the finish, the harder it's going to be to get to the finish. You need that refreshment along the way. And verse 2 going on to verse 3 is actually the water point here that Hebrews is calling you to come to. Come regularly to these water points. Fix your eyes on Jesus. Look at Christ's victory and what he's accomplished for you at the cross. And you will be refreshed with this life-giving water to keep running the race. This is why we're constantly called to keep looking to Jesus. Every time you look at the world, you should look back at Jesus, because he sets the perspective in how you see the rest of the world that you're in and how you run the race. If you lose that perspective, you're going to grow discouraged in the race. So consider Christ's victory is a water point on this race of faith. As is verse 3, and the other thing that we're called to consider, and that's Christ's example, verse 3. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Not only are we called to fix our eyes on Christ's victory and consider the gospel and the victory of Jesus at the cross, but also to consider his example as he endured such opposition and pain and suffering and struggle on the road to victory for us, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. You see, Christ's cross is not just the reason for our salvation, it is also the example for perseverance for those of us who have been saved. That's what we're called to do as we're running this race of faith. We're called to look to Christ's cross and remember his victory, something we need to be reminded of again and again. It's the water that refreshes us in the race of faith. And we're called to consider Christ's example as he endured the cross, as he endured opposition from sinners, as he suffered rejection at the hands of the world. We're called to consider that example so that we will not grow weary and lose heart. Because just as Christ endured the cross, so too must we. Just as Christ endured opposition from sinful people, so too will we. Just as Christ endured hardship and suffering, so too will we. And we're going to unpack in verses 4 onwards the purpose of suffering that God brings our way and why God allows it and what it's there for. We're going to see that next time. But first of all, what you must see in verse 2 and 3 is the understanding that we're not going to look for encouragement to endure in the race of faith through looking in ourselves. You know, you're not going to search for the hero inside yourself. You're not going to create your own reality. You're not going to follow your heart. Those are not biblical. That's not biblical wisdom, and that's not good Christian advice. It's kind of nonsense, actually. I don't even know what any of those things really mean. Inspirational, but empty. The reality is, we look to Jesus and his victory on the cross, and we learn from Jesus and his endurance at the cross. That's what we do as we're running the race of faith. And particularly in days where things really start to bite. And we're a long time now into this coronavirus crisis. And we're kind of living with it now. Here we are. We used to putting on our masks and we It's become part of us now, how we live. And the length of this crisis is becoming wearying to many of us, and discouraging, and the monotony of it, the difficulty of it, the hardship of it. Many are losing their jobs. It can become very wearying, and some people can give up on trusting in Jesus in this. And Hebrews says, don't do that. Keep looking to Jesus and his victory on the cross, nothing else. And keep learning from Jesus and his endurance to the cross. And that is the example that we are called to follow as we persevere in this life. And particularly in these days, where things are very trying and great difficulties are upon us, we will not finish if we allow ourselves to become entangled with sin, if we get caught up in things that seem like good causes but distract us from gospel causes, and if we take our eyes off Jesus, his victory at the cross, his endurance under suffering. We're called to follow him. Let's make time to do that, and continue to encourage one another to do that. Just as we're doing right now, as you're listening to this, I'm encouraging you to keep looking to Jesus and learning from Jesus. You can pass this on to someone else and encourage them to keep looking to Jesus and learning from Jesus. And even using the opportunities we have, places where you can meet one another, public places, do it. And so encourage one another with the word and with this gospel, with this victory of Jesus, and with Jesus' example. Make time to keep coming back to this, so that you and I will not grow weary and will not lose heart, because we keep our eyes fixed on him all the way to the finish.